Lasse, please make me an organizer. I cannot share my screen. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I hope you hear me. So good morning and welcome to our SLP1 third webinar. My name is Ana Droguțescu. You already know me. We've met in Thessaloniki. Today's webinar is focused on SUMP as a strategic document that achieves lasting improvements. I will be your moderator for today. I hope you can see my screen now. I will quickly explain you how the webinar works, even though you have attended 2 more webinars before. So you had the dial-in option via computer or via phone. Since you're already here, then this was a successful task for you. Everybody is muted due to, in order to avoid disturbances. Therefore, if you would like to speak, raise your hand. You have a little hand on the screen as the arrow is showing. So if you would like to speak, raise your hand and you will be unmuted and we will hear your question. In case you also want to type in your question, you have a window here, so you can type in your question and we will read it and understand how we can help you. Throughout the entire webinar, you will have some polls, so you will receive, you will be asked some questions and you will have to tick the appropriate answer, the answer that suits you. Therefore, we will see the results on the screen. I already have some questions. Okay, no. The webinar team for today will consist of our colleague from Ruprecht Consult, Lasse Brand. The name is totally wrong under Lasse's picture. My colleague from ICLEI, Richard Adams, will moderate and will be in charge of the poll questions, will moderate the discussions, and I will be the moderator for the entire seminar, for the entire webinar. What is it to be expected for today? So we will have 2 presentations. The first presentation will be offered by our colleague from Union of Baltic Cities, Maja Rusanen. It will be a presentation on the topic and introduction to the e-course, to the third e-course, and questions on this. And along with us today, we have our colleagues from the Birmingham City Council, David Harris and Joe Klarber, and they will offer us a presentation about the development of the Birmingham Transport Space Allocation Policy. As I mentioned previously, we will also have an interactive part, so that will be moderated by Richard, and you will hear from me again during the wrap-up and the latest announcements. So this being said, I will give the floor to Maja, and we will hear her presentation. Maja, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello, so I will share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I will, as Anna said, I will present or introduce you the third e-course and a bit about the topic for today. So just first a bit wrap up of the 2 previous lessons from the e-course for SLP1. So the first e-course focused on the analysis of the mobility situation and planning practices. And it addressed how to set up the management structures of SUMP process and how can you understand the context you are working in and how to organize the process of collecting data and analyzing the current mobility situation and how to also do that in cooperation with the stakeholders. And the second e-course focused on analysis, or sorry, on the mobility vision, priorities and objectives, that how to really select priorities and set up smart targets, and how to set up public participation and communication strategy. And then finally, how to set up a common vision for mobility in cooperation with different stakeholders and citizens. And the third learning block will focus on adapting, and that e-course will run from 5th of February until 25th of February. So you will have 3 weeks to complete the course as previously. And the previous SLP courses addressed mainly the first 2 main phases of the SUMP cycle: preparing well, and that focused on diagnosis, and then rational and transparent goal setting and visioning. We named that as visioning. And then this third module focuses on elaboration of the plan and adapting it to the local context. So mainly setting up the action plan, and then integrating the SUMP to other relevant strategies, and then also building monitoring and evaluation into the plan. And yes, the theme for the third course will be adapting the SUMP process to your local context. So this means how to initiate an integrated planning process, how to adapt the process to the local context, and how to actually elaborate the SUMP when we talk about the document, the plan itself, and then also how to overcome barriers and evaluate the process and the plan itself as well. And we could say that there are as many different ways to set up SUMP as there are cities. And the plan, of course, needs to be designed so that it reflects really the needs of your city, the capacities, and the specific planning context. However, we could say that there are also some common elements that all SUMPs include that result from implementing the different SUMP cycle steps and activities. So if you follow the SUMP cycle that was just presented, then you will most likely have these certain elements in your plan that form an important part of SUMP. And well, today we will also hear a practical example from the city of Birmingham. And their presentation will give overview the Birmingham's SUMP and current transport challenges, and then they will also introduce the transport space allocation policy, which aims to define how to allocate the scarce road space to meet the needs of different users and also use the available space the best possible way. So here you see an overview of the third e-course lesson. It has 6 units as usual, and I will explain a bit what will you learn during each of these units. So first will be strategy to initiate an integrated planning process, and the course will explore a bit like how to integrate SUMP with other relevant strategies, like how can, for example, SEA, strategic environmental assessment process, be helpful for SUMP, or how can SUMP harmonize with the SEAP, Sustainable Energy Action Plan, and also how can you identify the resources that you need to draft the SUMP, meaning funding and human resources. Then the course will also talk about how to adapt the process to the local context, how to really elaborate the plan that suits your planning context, and what are the key steps and tips to prepare SUMP action plan, which is really relevant part of the whole SUMP document. And then also a bit what elements are usually included in SUMP. Like I mentioned previously, that there are usually the common elements which are included in all SUMPs. The plan actually to be an SUMP. And then also what can you learn from best practice examples from cities that already have an SUMP. And the final part will be risk analysis and solutions, and that will address the common barriers in the SUMP process that many cities find difficult and how to also overcome the barriers. And then what are the do's and don'ts in the development process based on recommendations from our SUMP city partners who have already experience on SUMPs. And then also how to build up monitoring and evaluation into SUMP process, which is really crucial part of the process so that you will be able to address problems and challenges already in advance. And then how to really evaluate the plan itself and the process as well. And then some quick win solutions that there are to gain political capital. And we also, as before, we also have a task for you to do. And this time it's to prepare and draft SUMP and also identify the next steps, what you need to do in order to start, advance, or finalize your mobility plan. So it doesn't matter if you already have an SUMP, but you can still complete this task. And the purpose is to plan a content plan for the SUMP and identify the different elements or sections that the plan should have, and then also what steps you would need to implement in order to have those and what challenges are related. And this task will be also discussed in the Tampere workshop in March. But this was a brief introduction to the e-course, and that will kick off on February 5th. Okay, that was all from my side.
Thank you, Maya. Our colleagues from Birmingham should be online now.
Yes, they are.
They are?
I think before we hand over to Birmingham, there are two small questions that we would like to ask all participants. So I would start with that. Just as in the last webinars, we would like to make it a little bit interactive and also hear from you and about your status in your cities. So the first question that I will introduce is, does your city have an approved action plan? So with action plan, we mean what Maya had just introduced, that now we've moved into the second half of the SUMP cycle. And there we should do an action plan that prepares the implementation. So it's a quite concrete plan. It specifies a little bit the exact actions and the budget. It summarizes the measures, establishes priorities for implementation and of the schedules. So it's this kind of concrete plan that prepares implementation. I see that answers are coming in. 70% of you have chosen already. Still some additional answers coming, so I'll give you 10 more seconds. And now we have 90%, so I will show you the results. And we can see that it's quite diverse. Almost half of you already have an action plan, so will maybe be able to contribute and to talk about their lessons learned to the other half where the city doesn't have an approved action plan yet. Thank you for your participation. And I would like to follow up directly with a second simple yes and no question. And this one is, do you have a monitoring and evaluation plan integrated in your SUMP process? With this, we mean that we have emphasized several times that it can be very helpful to build monitoring and evaluation in SUMP. It's an important part, but it can also help you create more support for your measures. If you can clearly show in facts and numbers that something has worked, then it might be easier to convince certain groups, like we have also discussed at the last workshop in Brussels. So I can see that answers are coming in. 70% have chosen again. So a few more seconds. And then let's see. And it's a very similar picture. This time it's not 45, it's 44% of you who have a monitoring and evaluation plan. And the other, roughly more than half, 56%, do not have a monitoring and evaluation plan. So once again, I'm sure that this will prepare for interesting discussions in the forum, but also at the workshop in Tampere. And without further ado, I would like to hand over then the presentation role to our colleagues in Birmingham, who will present to you the practical insights from their city now. Joe, I have just made you moderator. I hope you can start sharing your screen now. Yes, looking good.
There we go. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
Is that better with the headphones on?
It's a lot better, yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. My name is Joe Klaver. I am working in the transport policy section of Birmingham City Council, and I have alongside me David Harris, who is the policy team manager. I think the way we're going to do this is David's going to do a bit of an introduction to Birmingham in general, some of the background about the city, and then we'll move on. I'll move on to some of the details, the technical specifics of transport space allocation in due course. So first of all, I'll hand over to David first of all.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start off and set the scene really, and paint the picture of and then why we're looking at a policy around allocating space. So a bit of background about
Can't hear you, David.
David, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe you can use the headphone as well when you present.
Can you hear me okay?
Coming and going.
Any better?
That's much better.
Okay, right. So I'm just setting a bit of context about Birmingham. It's a city of 1.1 million people. We're in the very sort of heart of England, in the Midlands. The wider metropolitan area, so the little diagram on the left of your slide shows where Birmingham sits in the wider West Midlands metropolitan area. And that wider area has almost 3 million people in it. So the city itself is quite vast, but the travel to work area is even greater. So the transport challenges that we face sort of come from outside our boundary as well as what we have to deal with within our administrative boundary. And I think it's worth just saying that everyone's heard of Manchester, but Birmingham is the second city after London. A bit of background really. It's an industrial city. It really is at the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries, and sort of built a very sort of firm base on a variety of different trades, different industries, and was once called the City of 1,000 Trades because of just the entrepreneurs that came to Birmingham to establish themselves. And Birmingham is rich with a history of engineers and others that led on all the things that we take for granted in daily life these days. Birmingham saw a massive population explosion during that period, so it grew from some 74,000 to over 500,000 in a very, very short space of time. And in many ways, that has set some of the problems that we now face, because we have sort of growth and expansion in the city that really wasn't well planned for. In more modern history, we've then seen some of that industry dying off, and whilst population increases have gone on, we've seen a decline in the traditional manufacturing in the city, so that the motoring industry that was here and others sort of fell away. So we've gone through a whole process of, re-diversifying our economy and seen the rising importance of the service sector in the city. Key things really that shape the modern sort of transport network of Birmingham was kind of the post-war era. Birmingham was quite badly damaged during World War II, and post-war there was sort of opportunity to sort of rid the city of slums and all the poor housing, and basically create a sort of, in inverted commas, modern city, which at that time in sort of UK policy terms was around the motor car and the emergence of mass private car ownership, and therefore the way the city was then built was thinking about, well, let's have lots of motorways, and Birmingham itself had a major ring road built right around, very tightly around the city centre, with a major sort of motorway going straight through the middle as well, which at the time seemed perfectly sensible, but now we know that that isn't really the way we want to plan or deliver our cities. So, what we've ended up with transport patterns and patterns of development that end up with overly reliant use upon the car. Just a few key facts really. So journey to work trips to Birmingham city centre, we have about 60% public transport mode share, which generally isn't too bad. Obviously we'd like to improve that. The rest of the city, and Birmingham's pretty polycentric, there are some major key centres which are the size of small towns across the city. You're only looking at a 60% mode share by car trips. So public transport is much less used outside of trips to the city centre, which is a key challenge for us in terms of how do we target some of that mode share. So there's this dispersal of employment and service facilities is clearly an issue. There's issues around inaccessibility and severance, where we've built these kind of urban motorways, some elements of economic inequality. But as we're finding, of course, the other issue is we've got pollution and environmental degradation, and Birmingham is one of 28 UK cities which is having to take urgent action on air quality, just simply to meet the legislative legal limits on things like nitrogen dioxide. But above and beyond that, there's more we're going to have to do to really benefit from the health impacts of cleaning up our transport network. In recent years, we've started to the tide, and a number of things, such as the top left is the sort of regeneration of Birmingham's main transport station, which is railway station, which is the busiest railway station outside of London in the UK. It serves both local and UK services, so you can pretty much get to any corner of the UK from Birmingham New Street Station. We've seen the continued expansion of our tram network, which now goes to New Street and is being further extended. And we've also got high-speed rail coming in the next few years, and it'll link to that. So there's been a lot of positive improvements, lots of regeneration in Birmingham over the last 10, 20 years. But the growth that's being forecast now, the Birmingham Development Plan, which is on the left, and then our Birmingham Connected Transport Strategy, we're going to have to do some radical shifts in terms of how we deliver transport in the city. And I think it's moving away from where we've been focused on moving vehicles, and we've got to move people. We've got to make our transport network efficient. We haven't got space to continue to build more and more capacity if equally we've got to fit 150,000 more people into the city, build 50,000 new homes, find space for employment, and so on. So there's a challenge about growing a city, keeping that city sustainable, reducing the impacts on individuals and particularly children. We're one of the youngest cities in Europe, so how we shape, how we deliver transport has it's a cradle to grave impact really. So if we get transport right and people have the right choices, they don't become car dependent at a young age. They use walking and cycling. They're healthier. they use public transport. There's a virtuous circle that has spin-offs into all sorts of elements of lifestyle and how people plan they're going to work, their leisure, and transport sits at the heart of that. And I think it's been neglected, not just locally, but in a UK context. We've planned around the car, and now we're reaping the outcomes of those decisions, really. The Birmingham Connected strategy, which we adopted in 2014, which is our SUMP, set out that case for a radical rethink. Really, it was like we can't do what's been done. It doesn't work. It's got us to here, and we're continuing. We're going down in a vicious circle. So that was the point the city sort of said, right, we've got to stop. We've got to do things differently. So we started on that journey, and anyone that's delivered a SUMP knows that these things don't happen overnight. It is a slow and at times painful process. But we started on that journey, and it's now sort of taking people with us. At the heart of that, and I was saying, it's about moving vehicles, not moving vehicles, moving people. So efficient transport networks where we can grow capacity without having to, accommodate further single occupancy car trips. Managing the network we've got, the capacity we've got in the most efficient way without having to take up more space for transport infrastructure unnecessarily. And then just some of the key facts, what we'd have to deal with in terms of car trips. So the growth that's forecast, 150,000 more people, could generate 80,000 more cars, putting more pressure on existing road networks. And that's 4 million trips on the transport network, both on public and by private car. And it's just not something that at the moment the transport network can accommodate. We've got to do it differently. One of the key things that we came up with was, it's arguably quite obvious, but making the case to politicians and others that we're going to have to reallocate road space. We're going to have to make some difficult decisions about who we prioritise in that restricted space that we have, and how do we quickly articulate the benefits for different users, and also make sure that as we design schemes, we have gone through a clear process where we've thought about who needs to use that space. And that could also be a discussion about not just where we need to accommodate movement, but also where we might want to think more about the function of an area as a place. So we might use it as a lever to say, actually, in these areas, we need to take traffic out because this is a place, it's dominated by vehicles, but actually we want it to be more about people, and people to spend time here and not be, sort of hounded out by parked cars, busy traffic and pollution. One of the key stats is this whole emphasis about moving people and not vehicles. And we've all seen the pictures of the cars turning into people sat on the road, and then you put them into buses. And this kind of articulates that really. The amount of road space you could take up with 19 cars, you can use that one bus or one car to take up, the space of 8 bicycles. There are better ways that we can move people around the city. And whilst Birmingham's big, and we do have some quite lengthy journeys from across the city into key centres, and particularly the city centre, we know that a lot of our trips, some 250,000 journeys a day, are less than 1 or 2 miles by car. So there's a lot of scope for us to mode shift a lot of those trips to more sustainable modes. And it's finding the tools to do it, and clearly creating different opportunities for people to travel by giving people with priority the public transport, walking and cycling on some of our roads is a key change that we need to make. And I think, that whole mindset about changing how we use parking, for example, or transport space allocation, the approach will help us set a case for making some of these changes that at the moment, I think both colleagues within a local authority, but also, politicians and others outside would sort of struggle to come to terms with. Reinforcing the point about sort of the movement, and this shows some of the volumes of people being moved by different modes, and you can see that quite clearly 366 cars, 366 buses, I apologise, moves, so many more people than those cars. It's just a no-brainer. And when you start to present information like that, it just turns the arguments on their head. You can't go on in this world where lots of people are driving around in cars on their own. Where did we get to? So in Birmingham Connected, we came up with a process of road space allocation that basically said, using tools like Link and Place, which is a approach in the UK where you assess either the link, so that's the road or the place, and then you sort of grade it by different factors, and you can weight it, and that starts to say to you, actually, in this location, your focus has to be on the link, and one extreme, a link is a motorway. It has no place function. It's purely about moving vehicles. The other extreme then is a very residential road. Yes, there's some movement of vehicles to get to people's houses, but actually it has a place as a community function. It's about people, and it's about your sort of graded approach about how you might make different decisions within those road spaces. And whilst that took us so far, we sort of generated a Link and Place grading for most of the city, where we were then struggling was that if we then wanted to make decisions in certain locations about what changes we made and how we made those, there wasn't a mechanism that sort of then gave us the next level of decision making. So we then started to think about network priorities and the road use hierarchy. What do we want to do with that section? If it's a major radial route, who do we want to move through there? Who gets priority? And then looking at, of those people, of those priorities, what is the level of service we're giving them, and what do we tolerate by level of service? That level of service could be things like journey time between 2 points. It could be pedestrian comfort because of the amount of curb space you've got. Cycling infrastructure, is it segregated? Is it of a standard that would give a less confident cyclist the ability to want to cycle along it? Because at the moment, if there were no provision, it might be too scary to cycle along certain lengths. For public transport, can we provide dedicated bus lanes? But also within that, other road users, and there's got to be a consideration of private car users. Yes, we want to shift people out of their private car, but we've still got to keep the city moving. So it's looking at all those different users and coming up with a tool that helps us decide, what level of service do we really want to achieve? What is the art of the possible? And then having an honest discussion with public or politicians about saying, well, we want to move more people, therefore we need to, for example, improve public transport. That's going to mean some difficult decisions about taking away road space from private cars. But through this process, we can sort of demonstrate the winners and the losers. And that allows, to say up front, yes, there'll be a level of service reduction for private cars, but actually there's more benefits for walking and cycling and all the other things that we want to try and achieve. And I think at a very, very high level stage, it starts bringing people along with what you're trying to do, because a lot of politicians and highway engineers will get very, very stuck in the fact that you're taking away capacity for wider traffic. And I think this is a way of trying to move beyond that debate, really. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Joe, who can talk us through more of the detail of how we apply and how we develop the policy and how we start to apply it.
Okay, thank you, David. You just said pretty much most of what I wanted to say. Yeah, I think just picking up on a couple of things that David said there. For me, I think this where transport space allocation is a useful tool is managing this transition away from car use towards alternatives over time. And I think one of the key challenges we have is how do we justify taking space away from motorists who are demonstrably using it at the moment to other modes who demonstrably aren't, and I'm thinking particularly cyclists. And the reason I mention cyclists is because of this phenomena that we have and I don't think it's entirely uniform to the UK by any means, but where we've got people that are driving for very short distances, for the sort of 1, 2, 3 mile trips, and it's the point at which the cycling is a potential alternative mode, and it's something that we don't do a great deal of. So I think that's just something I would mention as we go. I think the other point that I would make is about being careful that we don't, in applying the transport space allocation policy, we seek not to build in self-fulfilling prophecies. I think when we're establishing levels of service for different users, one of the aspects that we're grappling with at the moment is to understand, well, what is an appropriate minimum level of service for certain users, and how much stock do we place upon the existing function of a road? Because obviously, if we're interpreting the function of a road through the way it's used at the moment, then we're in danger of simply replicating what we've got on the ground at the minute. So in developing the policy, David's already touched on this, that the idea that we've classified the network in terms of its link and place function at the moment. We've identified network priorities across the system, and this is quite a subjective judgment, which is saying what is the function of different sections of the network, and what needs to be what is it doing at the minute that it needs to continue to do, what is it doing at the minute that it doesn't need to continue to do, and what will it need to do in the future. And that's, like I say, quite a subjective judgment, and it's also quite an aspirational way of looking at the process. And out of that, those two things drops the road user hierarchies, which is a way of setting, well, once you've established what the network is, what the link place function is, what the network priority is, here is your policy defined road user hierarchy, i.e. here's who you prioritize most, and here's who you prioritize less. Now I say less because it doesn't mean you don't prioritize them, it means that they are slightly lower down the pecking order. And the thing with the transport space allocation policy is that it's explicit that if you can fit everything in that you need to for all users, then that's what you should seek to do so. But clearly, and I think this is perhaps in my experience a little bit more the case in UK cities, possibly because of the way they've developed throughout the history, is they tend to be, even major corridors into the city can tend to be quite constrained in terms of space, where I think some of the continental cities that you go to, there seems to be, to me, quite a lot more space available to accommodate different people's needs. So moving on, the link place function. This is just a diagram of. I mean, David's already explained this. The definition of the function of a road through its link function and its place function. So I think that's fairly clear what that means. The link function being predominantly its movement function, and the place function being whether or not there are whether it's a specific location that people are looking to visit and spend time in. The network priorities, as I've mentioned, have already been defined, as I say, quite subjectively. And as you can see, this is an excerpt from the document, which shows that the major parts of the network have already been defined as their uses have been defined in terms of their network priorities. And then the levels of service, we're currently working through this, and I think there is a slide a bit later on that I'll spend a little bit more time on, but we've established, as David said, the way that the factors involved in measuring levels of service. So, for example, the motorists and public transport is typically a measure of how close to the expected normal conditions, free flow condition, journey time that you're achieving. So if it's, for example, 90% of the expected free flow journey time, you might grade that as an A rating. If it's sort of 60%, then that might be a C rating or similar. And then for cyclists and pedestrians, we're still working this through a little bit. It's at the moment, I think some of the measures that we have are quite in depth. And what we're seeking to do is to simplify a few of those measures so that it's a little bit more user friendly for the designers. So, for example, we've got some measures in relation to pedestrians in terms of the pedestrian comfort in an area, and what we're seeking to do is implement measures that would measure the simple footway width where that will be appropriate to do so, and less sort of time consuming where justified. And there is a sort of quick run through of some of the measures that we use to grade level of service. That's just basically what I've run through. And then the outcomes, we assess each scheme by different user, whether the impact of each scheme. One thing that I think we do need to be aware of as we do this is how we look to allocate a level of service, a minimum level of service to different users. So, for example, we set an aspiration for level of service for different users, but then clearly in many cases that the aspirational level of service will not be met for all users. So you might have a corridor that is rated as a major radial for major route into the city centre for motorists, has been identified as a cycling priority corridor, and has been identified as a public transport priority corridor, and the space just isn't available to achieve the sort of A or B rating for each of those different modes. So what this allows us to do is to provide an audit trail of what we have considered, the measures that we have, or the potential schemes that we have rejected, or the individual measures we've rejected, and why we've done so, and how that is communicated to elected members and to the wider general public. And I think in terms of setting a minimum level of service, we've had some debate recently about how we would go about setting that, and I think one of the sort of base standards that I think we're looking to use is, well, it's kind of where are we headed anyway? So we need to accommodate, as we've said, a significant amount of development. All the conditions for network users are, for different mode users, are all uniformly gradually worsening over time, in some cases rapidly worsening. So we can articulate that we're kind of all going there anyway. So actually, if we end up making things slightly worse for motorists in a slightly shorter time frame in order to break this vicious cycle of decline, then what we can demonstrate is that, well, yes, for motorists, we might make it slightly worse a little bit quicker than it would otherwise have done. But in doing so, we've actually managed to implement the improvements to alternative modes that mean that not only are we delivering for the capacity to accommodate growth and to start shifting people towards using the appropriate modes or more sustainable modes, actually, hopefully in doing so, the level of service for motorists won't ever worsen to the point that it would have done anyway, because of course what we're doing is seeking to attract motorists out of the car to use the alternatives. And then with some points about the benefits of the policy, so the key is to ensure better decisions are made and more transparent decisions are made by considering the strategic transport objectives in the use of the road network, defining the clear hierarchy for modal priority, targeting efficient investment in road improvements, allocating public transport priority, encouraging cycling and walking. Now, again, going back to cycling, I think cycling, particularly in this country, is quite an interesting mode. It is, in my view, it is the real missing mode. It's the mode that we, whenever you see a graph of different mode use in the UK, actually our walking rates and to some degree our public transport rates are comparable to many certainly countries on the near continent. Say, for example, the likes of the Netherlands, Denmark. We're not too bad in comparison to countries like that. But where we clearly have a missing mode is in cycling mode share. And of course, cycling feeds into public transport use, and cycling feeds into people walking more and leaving the car at home. So I think with cycling, particularly where we've got these significant space constraints, added to the fact that we don't have a history of a culture basis for reallocation towards cyclists, I think cyclists present us with something of a challenge, but then they also present us with quite a sort of neat little solution in some respects. If actually we can allocate for cyclists along wider corridors. So I don't want the policy to end up being a sort of default position that if you can't fit everything in, then cyclists are the ones to get shifted out. But there are opportunities to shift cyclists onto perhaps carry on running residential routes that are themselves appropriately treated for cyclists. Whereas that wouldn't be appropriate for motorised traffic, clearly, because obviously you're displacing congestion, pollution, road safety issues, and it wouldn't be appropriate for public transport because, of course, as soon as somebody steps off the public transport vehicle, they become a pedestrian, and therefore, if they're 400 metres away from where they need to be, they're not getting there particularly quickly, whereas cyclists can. So I think there's some creative thinking that needs to be done in that respect. We'll move on. Implementing the policy, as I say, we're currently in the process of looking at several public transport improvement schemes, corridor schemes, known as sprint schemes in Birmingham, and we are in the process of applying this guidance. But it is still a work in progress, so we're kind of having to feel our way through it a little bit. It's not a new design guide, it's not meant to be prescriptive, and it does have limitations. It will only get you so far, but what we're working on at the moment is it becoming perhaps a more user-friendly document that designers can pick up and doesn't prescribe to them what they need to do, but equally is detailed enough that they have something to sort of hang their hat on, and they can be confident in policy terms that when they need to make the difficult decisions and shift space away from motorists towards alternative modes, they can be confident that they can do so in a justified manner. Okay, I think that's about everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Joe. I think that was a very inspiring presentation that I'm sure we will have a lot of questions about, and that's why the next big part will be an interactive session that Richard from eClay will lead. But before we dig into that, I will once again pose a little question to our participants. And this time you will have a multiple choice question asking you what the main challenges or barriers are that you are facing in your SUMP development in your city so far. We've heard from Birmingham about one way to take decisions in difficult situations where road space is limited and where you might face a lot of resistance if you take away space, for example, from the car. But of course, there can be other challenges and barriers as well. That's why we are asking you, what are the main challenges and barriers in your cities? Is it a lack of resources, finances, knowledge, skills, or personnel? Is it that the stakeholders are not defined, or that you have problems to involve them, so the participation? Is it issues with coordination or institutional cooperation, so how you work together with other departments, or how you work together with institutional stakeholders? Is it a lack of political commitment to agree on measures? And this might be something quite connected to the case that Birmingham put forward, that it can be difficult for politicians to commit or something where there's a lot of resistance, or when the discussion is not fact-based anymore, when it's mainly emotional, and where Birmingham presented one way how you can try to frame the discussion in a different way to put it down again to the facts, clearly showing what will happen. Or could it be that in your city there's not enough data available, that you have problems to make all these evaluations or to even make these predictions? So there's a lot of potential challenges, and the answers have come in. We have 71% of you who have 75%, 79%. So I think most of you have chosen. So I will close the poll now and show you the results. And there is a wide range of different challenges. So actually all of the challenges that I just mentioned are main challenges in some of your cities. The lack of resources seems to be the biggest problem. It seems to be a big constraint in 79% of your cities. The stakeholders also discussed a lot already in the previous workshops. The stakeholders seem to be less of a problem now. Then there is issues with coordination, and I'm not surprised by that, because that can always be difficult to break up the silos and to work together. A lack of political commitment is also, more than half of you have problems with that. And that's, of course, a constant struggle to convince politicians. And then the last one also, that there's a lack of data, seems to also be a prevalent problem. So thanks for your answers. We will take that with us in the next block, and also surely in the next workshop. But now that you have had some time to let the presentation sink in from Birmingham, I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions, and that Richard has prepared an inspiring interactive session. So I will hand over the microphone to Richard now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you on behalf of all my colleagues and myself. I'd like to say thank you very much again for attending today's webinar. Most of you probably know me from the first webinar we had when I introduced some aspects of the programme, and I'm very happy to be back speaking to you today. So I would firstly like to say my local pride as a person who was born and grew up in Birmingham. I'm very happy to see that my city, which I grew up in what was once a congested city, but every time I go back, I see the vast progress that is made within the city, particularly with regards to how more people are being moved using sustainable modes of transport. And as Joe and David both mentioned, the goal of the city is now to move people as opposed to cars. So Joe, if you would please mind turning your mic on, because I thought the best way that we would approach this session is that if the cities that are taking part have any questions, that they can actually then pose questions to yourself and Birmingham, and then you can give them answers as a city who has gone through the SUMP process. And from your experience and knowledge, they can then gain some pearls of wisdom that can take them further forward than perhaps I can as a simple mobility expert and practitioner. So guys, if you have any questions, if you could please look into the panel on the far right hand side of your screen and enter those into the box, then I will moderate a discussion using the questions that you pose, and Birmingham can, using its experience, provide us their insight into the questions that you provide. So I will firstly, before some of you can please post some questions, I would firstly kick off with one of my own. So Joe, how exactly how did you go about convincing politicians? Obviously you have the fact-based argument, but what level of resistance did you find that there was based simply upon the notion that cars are the way that things work? That was it a matter of tradition, or was it just people were not convinced by sustainable modes as well?
No, I think there is an emerging, certainly much more of an acceptance that we can't carry on doing things as we've been doing them. I think there is a tendency, and I wouldn't say this is the case of Birmingham specifically, but I think there is a case in the UK that we have tended to kind of muddle through, and things just about work, and it's maybe that's a cultural thing, I don't know, but we kind of just about get by. But now we are at the point where I think over the past 20 or so years, I mean, you saw some of the slides with some of the developments that have gone on in Birmingham over that period of time. I don't think this is a new phenomenon. I think we clearly have been investing in different transportation systems. You see the investment in New Street Station. You see the investment in the commitment to high speed too, and the sort of the money that has come back into cities in general in terms of office development, new residential development, and regeneration within the city as a whole. And I think now people are understanding that needs to be serviced. That people's movement needs need to be serviced appropriately. And now we've got the levels of growth forecasts that we have. I think that only adds to it. So I don't think there is a particular resistance to change. It's just how we go about managing that transition from sort of a car-dominated system to more sustainable modes, and how we do that in a reasonable and justified way. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question, or if you want me to expand a bit more. But
well, I think that's a very good point in terms of that you need to make it a gradual approach, because if you try and do too much at once, then that can lead to resistance. But obviously there is, shall we say, there's sometimes just a lack of understanding amongst stakeholders or politicians, and then so in order to bring or to engender that understanding, you need to involve them in the process. So to what extent, when Birmingham, during the drafting and creation of Birmingham Connected, and also in the upcoming public consultation of the road space allocation policy, what measures and ways have you, or will you, be involving the public? Is it in a smaller level on focus groups, or is it more public meetings or surveys? What are the methods that Birmingham is using, please, to try and get citizens involved in the transport policy development process?
Okay, I'll hand over to David to answer this one.
Hiya. When we did Birmingham, we did quite a broad range of engagement. So large counties of consultation on what we called a green paper at the time.
Sorry, we can't hear you very well. Could you maybe put the microphone a bit closer?
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we did a citywide consultation on what we called a green paper. So that was sort of issues and options. It set out the evidence base, what we considered to be the key problems. We looked at the population growth, demographics, transport statistics and information, and set out a picture of the challenges facing Birmingham, and then against that set out a range of options. So some of the slides we showed earlier was saying, well, we're going to have 80,000 more cars. That's going to put 4 million daily trips on the transport network. And it's then sort of saying, well, in a do-nothing scenario, what does that look like? And then sort of gradually saying, well, we could do this, we could do. And some of the ideas that were in the initial green paper were quite radical. And clearly people are more averse to the extremely radical options. But equally, there's that kind of, using the consultation to find the middle ground where people are comfortable. And I think, there was a consensus that there was a change in the way transport is provided and delivered in the city, and how we deliver that. And I think Richard's point about, some of it can't be sharp, short shock. I think absolutely you're right. I think where we are in Birmingham at the moment is we're in a unprecedented situation where we're about to see levels of development and growth in the city over the next 10 years that I don't think any of us that are working here now have ever seen in our lifetime. And that's going to require some really different thinking about how we deal with that at the moment. And that's not just at the officer level. I think it's then politicians that are kind of grappling with that as well. We've got so much development happening in Birmingham city centre. There's growth in terms of the jobs and the housing. But we're building massive infrastructure projects like the high-speed 2 rail line. We've got large parts of the city being completely regenerated. And that's going to put pressure on the transport network. We've got to put a clean air zone in the next couple of years. And so whilst we've been kind of using the principles of Birmingham Connected to do that sort of teasing it slowly and turning direction, actually now we're kind of thinking we've got an opportunity. We're going to have to do some of the radical stuff very, very quickly. Otherwise, the transport network isn't actually going to be able to cope with the level of pressure and demand on the network. So that's just an interesting part. I think there can be opportunities where you can implement quite radical shift, because you can show that unless we do something very, very differently, then the city won't deliver on its wider objectives for regeneration, economic growth, and managing that change sustainably, really. Just going back to the consultation, so we did a number of things. We did a sort of online consultation, questionnaires. We did a number of focus sessions around the city, drop-ins, so people could come talk to officers and discuss what was in the document and proposals. We did a number of sort of big events at so the town hall in Birmingham, where the leader of the council presented to key stakeholders about what the council's vision and priorities were for transport and why we had to do something differently. And we did sort of focus groups with sort of stratified kind of targeted people from different walks of life, different communities, to really try and get a representative view of people's opinions of transport. So, there was a lot of work done, which then formed sort of the discussion around the green paper, and that was then turned into the Birmingham Connected white paper, which is now our transport strategy. So a lot of work and a lot of consultation went on, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the insight. So as you see, so we all hear that it's a very rigorous process, essentially. So there was that clear citizens consultation, but we've had a question from Martin Berlin, which was, so he wonders what the politicians' biggest concern was or has been, and so that how have they expressed their opposition or concerns to Birmingham's future transport plans and indeed wider urban development future?
How the politicians?
What has their biggest concern been?
I think the biggest concern that we've seen really is the shift of saying that, you know, we might make things worse, or we're going to make things worse for private car drivers. Because I think whilst there's a lot of paying lip service to doing that, actually when push comes to shove, when you actually have to make those calls, that's difficult for politicians because it's not favourable. And even when we set out things like the race-based allocation, which tries to demonstrate why over the longer term we are making things better, I think they still struggle with it. I think that will continue to be the issue. It takes someone very, very bold and very, very robust to be quite anti-car, particularly in a city like Birmingham. And I think that's one of the biggest struggles. I think from a development point of view, I just think it's making sure that our transport decisions, or how we decide. So one of the key issues is how do we fund transport? So there's lots of things in Birmingham Connected and also in the wider West Midlands Strategic Transport Plan that are unfunded. There are major infrastructure changes we want to make, but we can't fund them. So, you know, within the UK, looking at different models of funding transport infrastructure are being cooked up. And some cities have been successful taking forward things like congestion charging or workplace parking levies, for example, Nottingham. But a lot of cities outside London, it's very sort of standard kind of approaches. In Birmingham, we've been lucky, we've got an enterprise zone. Some of our new infrastructure, metro extensions are being sort of built on the back of the enterprise zone, the uplift in business will generate. And also through the HS2 connectivity package that was negotiated with government, we've got, you know, a vast sum of investment to support infrastructure, but still there are a lot of projects that we want to deliver that we can't fund. So there's also that kind of decision. We want the growth, we want, you know, to develop sustainably, but how do we do that? And if we want to improve our transport infrastructure, we need to think about different ways of funding it. So, you know, we do need to think about those controversial things, be that workplace parking levies, but things like value capture as well. But there's always a difficulty because you could be images that could be seen to be detrimental.
Could you adjust your microphone a bit? It's a bit difficult to hear again.
Is that better?
A bit.
Is that, yeah? Okay. I'll talk as loud as I can. So, I mean, those are the key issues, really.
Sorry, David, could you very quickly just do a very short summary of that in case people missed the last 30 seconds or so?
In summary, I think the key issues really are being perceived to be anti-car, and a lot of the measures we're promoting through the likes of Birmingham Connected are based on, you know, trying to encourage, whether that be with a carrot or a stick, people to not use their cars so much. And I think the other issue is around how we fund transport, and that may also lead to decisions around things that are not popular, would be that workplace parking or charges to developers.
Okay, fantastic. So there are some good, that gives you an example of, even though Birmingham has successfully developed its SUMP and is now moving forward with the process, it shows that it doesn't come easily to anyone, regardless of, and Birmingham has a lot of political support, seemingly, behind the process. So it's something that all of us, or all of you, will encounter in your local authorities when developing your SUMPs. So in terms of, now that we've spoken about the political process and the getting stakeholders on board, I was just wondering, David and Joe, so for the other cities that are here, how have you worked together? Because obviously, as we know, SUMP is an integrated planning approach. That implies that you work together with other departments, other policy fields, other topical areas. What has your cooperation with other departments within Birmingham City Council looked like, which I believe is the largest in Europe? And how have you gone about linking your work with that of other areas? Have certain structures worked? What have the challenges been? And how have you been able to facilitate effective collaboration and cooperation with other departments?
Okay, I think the first key point to make is that the Birmingham Connected transport strategy was sort of based upon and relates directly to the city's land use development plan, and which at the highest level sets out the sort of the growth that we forecast in the city. So the current development plan has a planning horizon of 2031. And it's kind of making sure that the land use and transport planning is aligned as far as possible, because clearly, you know, some of those big infrastructure changes are going to be focused on not just the city centre, but where you've got major growth and regeneration projects happening across the city. For example, to the north east of Birmingham, we've got a major regeneration site in the Greenbelt. It's controversial because using Greenbelt land is seen as almost like a measure of last resort. But in terms of what we need to do in terms of providing employment, sites and housing, we've had to use...
sorry, 1 second, Joe. Could you please just clarify what Greenbelt land is, and people don't know?
Say again, do I need to clarify?
Could you please just quickly clarify what Greenbelt land is, in case people don't know the term?
So Greenbelt land is really just areas of land around major urban areas to stop sort of encroachment of urban areas, to stop them joining up, really. So in planning policy terms, it's protected, and there are a lot more stringent planning conditions and policies to stop development in those areas, on the basis that we don't want, you know, massive urban areas just all start to join up. And in the UK, it has been a key policy around areas like London and major cities like Birmingham to stop further urban growth into the surrounding countrysides. So I think it's that coordination between the planning and transport, the land use planning and the transport, which has been critical. I think, you know, Birmingham Connected is mapped back onto that growth and where we need to focus the transport investment around where we're targeting the growth and regeneration. In terms of delivery and making that work, so obviously transport policies is one element of the transport department, but I think I alluded to it earlier. It's always taking other parts of the council with you, and I think working with some of our engineering colleagues and infrastructure projects teams is quite difficult, because you're getting them to think about delivering things in a different way. And it's one thing to have the policies and the guidance, but you've got to take them on a journey with you, because, you know, historically, you know, worked on projects. This is what a civil engineer does. This is how we deliver things. And actually, you've got to get them to approach and come to a scheme with a different mindset. And I think as we've moved on, that has become challenging, because where we've developed policy and then sort of we've been hands off in terms of delivery, things have then happened, and then the question has come back as well, why have we delivered this like this? And it's kind of, you know, as we've gone through learning that we've got to make sure that everyone is on that journey, and I think that is really a key issue. It's changing, but that's been a difficulty. And it is then, you know, there are so, you know, transport bleeds into so many other things, and within the council there are different elements of a local authority that have an influence on transport. And I think, you know, in the UK, and it's probably the same for European colleagues, the school journey creates so much transport, and working with other departments to look at how we might change how, you know, schools deal with transport and children getting to school is another key challenge for us. I could go on. There are lots of others. Procurement, you know, how we you know, procure services and vehicles, and particularly with the air quality agenda, making sure that those departments think about types of vehicles that are being procured, and, you know, are there the right emissions and those sorts of things. So there's all sorts of challenges across lots of areas. And I think for anyone starting off on their SUMP journey, it all becomes very, very overwhelming very, very quickly, because there's so many things that you need to do. And I think there's then, you need to manage expectation, because you can't do all this overnight. It is at times like turning an oil tanker in concrete. Not even treacle in concrete. It can be that difficult, but over time it does get easier. Well, it seems to be anyway.
There we go. So positive news for everyone here. It does actually get easier, despite any of the opposition you might face.
Eventually.
That was needlessly negative. Thank you. So so if any of you have questions, whilst we have Birmingham here, I would please urge you to just put them into the chat. We still have a few minutes left, so we can definitely get a couple more questions in. So just kind of slightly from an interested local boy who grew up in the area, just while we wait for a few more questions, could you please, how do you think, on a more personal note, how do you think the city will have changed in 10 years' time? Do you think the quality of life will have been achieved that you hope will be brought about by the transport measures? Or will at some point expectations have to be reduced? And will you be satisfied if you don't achieve everything that you have set out in the plan, in Birmingham Connected and in the Birmingham Development Plan? Hello? Sorry, could you please just start that again? We didn't catch the first. Yeah, that's better, Joe. Could you, if you could go, please?
I think we're on a really positive journey already.
Oh no, sorry, Joe. Sorry, Joe, you dropped out again. Could you maybe try and use David's microphone, perhaps?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. I think we're already on a.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, it's getting difficult again.
Sorry.
There we go.
Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay.
Keep it there.
I think we're on a really positive journey. We've got, one of the highest quality of life of any English city outside of London. And I think with a lot of the investment that's happening, we will continue on that journey. In terms of the second part of your question, do I think that we will deliver all the transport measures in 10 years? Is that?
Do you think that that's realistic?
I think, given the programme we've got and some of the key things that we're going to deliver, so the HS2 connectivity programme, which will see our bus rapid transit network started, the metro extensions through to the HS2 station out to the east of the city. Absolutely, I think the rail improvements we're going to have as well, they will get delivered. I think there are questions around whether some of the other things that we've started to look at can be delivered. As I said earlier, it very much depends on the funding. But I think even if we can deliver what we've got committed through things like the HS2 connectivity package, we will see a step change. And I think if we can do some of the things around race-based allocation and make those noises about, actually, we're not a car city anymore. We are a city about, good public transport. We want to be a world-class city for public transport and good connectivity. I think we will be much of the way there. It's as much about mindset and people's perception of the city as it is about just delivering the infrastructure. I think we already have a reasonable public transport network in Birmingham. I just think it's about shifting the perception of that as well, and making people think about how they travel differently. And that's a really difficult task for any city, really.
Sorry, there we go. I had to unmute myself. So you're talking about something to put out to both of yourselves, just as we come slowly towards the close. So both to those of you participants in the audience, please, Lasse just put some questions in the chat. If you could please just have a look and maybe have a think about how a level of service might impact defining those levels of services that you offer to the various types of transport users that you have in your city, how that might impact on the SUMP that you're developing. And to put that question back to Birmingham, whilst our participants consider what different levels of service they will develop, you mentioned very briefly about the baselines for the level of service. Have they been clearly defined for each mode so far? Will they be qualitative or quantitative? And what sort of area will they cover? Will you have kind of a pilot area in which you measure these different levels of service, or will it be the whole of the city?
Good question. I think this is.
Sorry, could you please just bring the mic a bit nearer, David?
Joe, is that any better?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
I think it is something.
Oh no, sorry, no, that's gone. It worked really well with the last question. If you could try and do it the same way again, that would be great.
Pretty much exactly where David was. So.
Yeah, no, that's good now. That's good now. Yeah, thanks.
I think it's the connection between the laptop and the wireless, to be honest. Yeah, I think in terms of level of setting, I think it's a bit of a work in progress at the moment, and I think we're currently working through, as I say, some public transport corridor schemes that we're looking to develop it as we go to some degree. And you say about setting the standards. I think what we're investigating at the minute is whether or not we set minimum standards on the basis of the combined link place existing link place valuation, if you like, and the identified network priorities. What we're essentially saying here is an objective place by place and saying, well, this is the level of service that it is at the moment. So what we'll do is essentially allow it to fall by one grading point or whatever that might be. I think the danger of that is that we could fall into building self.
Oops, sorry. The mic's dropping in and out. If you could please try and move a bit quicker. Move a bit closer, and then as the clock strikes 12, it might also be time to slowly wrap up.
Okay. So yeah, sorry about the mic.
That's fine. The sound quality is great. If you could please just summarise what you said, that'd be great.
Yeah, basically I was saying it's a work in progress in terms of level of service. I think what we're doing at the moment is investigating whether or not we set an objectively set minimum level for each user, i.e. one that's preordained, if you like, rather than going from place to place and seeking to set a minimum on the basis of what's there already. Because I think what we've got to avoid is delivering self-fulfilling prophecies. And the danger, I think, is that where transport space allocation policy is where it might fall down if we're not able to say, well, actually, a linked place valuation of 3C or whatever we've set it as, and here are the network priorities. That means that the minimum level of service for motorists, whatever it is at the moment, is grade C or grade D or whatever it might be, so that we have room to manoeuvre. Because if we don't do that, then I think the temptation will always be that it will that we'll allow it to fall a bit, but we may not be able to deliver some of the more ambitious sustainable transport measures. And just David, in relation to the last question, I think one of the key challenges that we have is not simply to deliver for different users, is to deliver the right type of infrastructure for different users, and there needs to be an understanding of who are you designing for, who do you need to be catering for, who do you need to attract onto these networks. So, for example, I've mentioned about cycling earlier on. Pedestrians and cyclists, I think the big ticket items, if you like, the public transport, the metro, the sprint, the rail, will be delivered. I think where we need to be mindful of is the need to deliver very safe networks for pedestrians and cyclists, by which I'm thinking particularly about children and the elderly and mobility impaired. And if we can do that, I think we can achieve a lot.
Fantastic. Thanks for that great answer, Joe. And so something that he clearly reflected in his answer there is the need to, you need to understand who you're delivering your transport service for, what their needs are, and then make the infrastructure fit according to what they require, as opposed to what you think transport within an urban area should look like. And importantly, transport needs to be safe and inclusive as well. So thank you very much for the fantastic discussion and the questions I received as well, and Birmingham as well for the great answers. I think we've all certainly learned a lot today from the experience that Birmingham's brought with them, and it's something that we can all take forward and implement and integrate into the development of SUMPs within our own areas. So thank you very much, guys. I will now hand back to Anna, who will wrap up the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. I need back my organizer's rights. Thank you. Okay. So thank you, Richard, for moderating this very interesting discussion. Thank you, David and Joe, for bringing in your expertise from Birmingham. Just to wrap up, a few words. If you know where to contact us, you can use the help desk email that you've already used before. The SLP1 facilitator is Maya. Therefore, if you need to talk to her, you can write to her directly or to our SLP1 manager, which is Anna Maria. All the presentations and the webinar recording will be available on Mobility Academy, which you already know how to use. And just a short reminder that the e-course will run from 5th of February to 25th of February 2018, with a number of 2-3 hours per week for 3 weeks that you will have to dedicate to this e-course. And on the 14th of March, you will meet for the 3rd time in Tampere in Finland for the 3rd webinar, for the 3rd workshop. Please remember to register for this event. Thank you, everybody, for listening and for participating. Thank you to our presenters and to my colleagues from Ruprecht UBC and ICLEI. And looking forward to meeting you in Tampere. Bye.
Thank you.